It was one of the most feared, high-performance weapons of the 20th century. When it appeared in the skies over Korea, it sent the unsuspecting West spiraling into a state of shock. It was the Russian-made MiG-15.
We were at full throttle, doing as fast as we could go, and we were barely keeping up with it.
Until the arrival of the American F-86 Sabre, the Russian jet outclassed everything in the sky, astonishing American pilots with its lightning maneuverability and intense firepower.
We could hit the MiG a number of times, and the MiG wouldn't necessarily go down. But if the MiG hit an F-86 with those cannons, the F-86 was not going to make it home.
But under the umbrella of the Cold War, this deadly game of aerial combat held a dark secret that threatened to throw the world into nuclear war. Using unique Soviet archive film and color reenactments, Heavy Metal enters the secret world of the MiG-15. Russia in the 1920s was a country of turmoil, revolution, and change. Stalin's reign of terror permeated every aspect of life in the Soviet Union. Soviet aircraft designers lived in a world of secrecy and fear. Although well behind the West, Soviet designers were actively experimenting with advanced technology. But by the late 1930s, much of this innovative work would never see the light of day. Aircraft designers knew that to fail could mean banishment to a labor camp in Siberia or a bullet in the back of the head.
You were living under an administration which was happy to shoot large numbers of engineers or anybody else on simple whims, political whims or whatever. And so there was an atmosphere that really is very difficult for people in the West to understand.
Stalin astonished the world in August 1939 by signing a non-aggression pact with Germany. When his top engineer discovered that the German Me-109 fighter was far superior to anything in the Soviet Union, Stalin flew into a rage. Nikolai Polikarpov, his chief designer, immediately fell out of favor as too old and staid. Stalin began to search for a younger and more dynamic team. He selected a young designer named Artem Mikoyan to head a new design bureau and tapped Mikhail Goryevich as his deputy.
Artem
Ivanovich was, of course, a designer, but an exceptional organizer, too. He was the ideas man, whereas Gurevich was someone who was very good at detail and fine-tuning the designs.
Artem Mikoyan was from Armenia, the son of a carpenter. He had trained as a pilot in the Soviet Air Force and later became an engineer. His brother was on Stalin's Council of Ministers. By 1937, he had joined the main Soviet design bureau led by Polikarpov. Here he worked on several successful aircraft designs. Now he would replace his boss and lead the Soviet Union into the jet age. Mikhail Goryevich was a Ukrainian. He trained as an engineer, and after the revolution became an aircraft designer in Moscow. Here he met Mikoyan and they became good friends.
Gurevich liked Artem Mikoyan a lot. He was perfectly happy to be his deputy. They were both kind and decent people, and that's also why they worked so well together.
The motto of the new experimental bureau was speed and altitude. All their future aircraft designs would be known as MiGs, after the combination of its creators' names. It was the start of a partnership that would be associated around the world with successful aircraft for decades. Then, in June 1941, Hitler launched his surprise offensive against the Soviet Union. Stalin's Air Force was totally unprepared and ill-equipped to fight the modern German fighters. Russian losses were massive. Final victory over the Nazi war machine was largely due to the remarkable success of the Red Army. The Soviet Air Force was left in the Dark Ages. By the end of the war, tensions that would soon turn into the Cold War began to grow. The Allies now had the jet engine, space rockets, and the atom bomb. Soviet designers needed to catch up, and catch up fast.
Stalin was furious that the Soviet Union's technology had fallen behind that of the West, and he told his designers to bridge the gap. Not an easy task, and Stalin wasn't the sort of man that you argued with, but in one respect, Soviet technicians did have an advantage. They'd captured a lot of German technology, amongst it the German Me-262 jet fighter, and they were able to build on this to build their own jet at what was the beginning of the atomic age.
The Mikoyan and Goryevich team took advantage of this captured technology and began to develop a new jet fighter, the MiG-9.
Первоначально проект МиГ-9 предусматривал расположение двигателей как...
At first it was planned with MiG-9 to put the engines in the same place as the Me-262.
Решение от этого отказались.
But later on a different decision was made, and the engines were placed in the fuselage, which was recognized to be more effective.
Дальнейшие испытания показали,
Tests proved that this was the correct decision.
сделан правильно.
In April 1946, fitted with 2 German BMW jet engines, the MiG-9 was the Soviet Union's first prototype jet ever to fly. At high speeds, bailing out would now become sheer suicide, so the first ejection seat in the USSR was successfully tested. It was just one of the jet age's many design problems that had to be solved.
They realized in order to reach high speed, close to the speed of sound, they needed a new arrow-shaped wing. That wing would push back the shock wave and air resistance in order to achieve much higher speeds.
The design and transition from a straight wing to a swept back wing was to give the MiG its most famous characteristic. Now, with the cigar-shaped fuselage and swept wings, all the jet fighter needed was a much more powerful engine.
The problem with the Me-262 engine, which the Germans had run into and was the major factor in its late appearance in the war, was how do you make a turbine blade stay on the turbine given the kinds of pressures you're putting on a jet engine? And that was a problem which the Soviets were not capable of solving.
At this crucial moment, the new post-war British government, as part of a trade agreement, invited Mikoyan and a Soviet delegation to visit the British Rolls-Royce engine factory. For the Russians, it was a potential gold mine, access to the latest Rolls-Royce jet technology. Stalin reacted with typical suspicion, asking, what fool would sell us his secrets? On arrival in July 1946, Mikoyan and the Soviet delegation were welcomed with typical British hospitality.
He was invited to the house of one of the Rolls-Royce bosses, and they played English billiards. Artem played billiards well. I know, because I played billiards with him many times. He'd lost one game and then offered a challenge and said, let's play another game, and if I win, you sell us your jet engines.
It was a close game, but the Russians won. Bizarrely, the future course of the MiG was settled across the green felt of an English pool table. Mikoyan had beaten the British at their own game. He had won the famous Rolls-Royce jet engine on a bet.
It sounds like an anecdote, but he told me that this was true.
Although the Russians were about to receive the best of British jet technology, certain questions remained. The visit to the Rolls-Royce factory would put them to rest. The Russians had another trick up their sleeves.
Самый главный вопрос – это материал, из чего сделаны лопатки.
The most important question was what were the blades made of?
С производством.
During the tour of the factory, one of the members of the delegation wore special boots with spongy soles, and he secretly trod all around the metal lathe, so lots of shavings stuck to his boots.
Только вытаскивал.
He took these shavings back to analyze in the USSR, so by the time the engine was purchased, they already knew the composition of the alloy, and this helped to speed up the copying of the Nene engine and launch the Russian engines into mass production.
Запуска в серию двигателя РД-45F.
The supposedly harmless gift of the jet engine turned out to be a deadly mistake by the British. The Rolls-Royce jet engine was quickly copied, and Stalin at last had his new generation of jet fighter aircraft. In just 4 years, MiG-15s would be shooting down American and British planes over Korea.
You're watching Heavy Metal here on the History Channel.
Everybody stand back! This is gonna be violent!
Mail Call, tonight at 8. You're watching Heavy Metal here on the History Channel.
The Tuchina Air Show, Moscow, July 1949. A new generation of Soviet MiG-15 jet fighters are paraded in front of Stalin and the public for the first time. The MiG designers Mikoyan and Goryevich had been awarded the Stalin Prize for their winning design. The MiG-15 had a maximum speed of 652 miles per hour and was capable of flying at 50,000 feet. It was given powerful armament with two 23mm and a single 37mm cannon. Most of the pilots who flew the MiG-15 were enormously impressed.
My first impressions are hard to describe in words. In the MiG-15, the conditions for the pilot were wonderful. It was designed with love. The view was fantastic because the cockpit was right at the front of the plane. While I was flying, it was like gliding over a precipice.
The MiG-15 at first sight seemed to me to be like a new day in aviation. I can't describe it in words. It was indescribable. First of all, silence, as if the plane was standing still on Earth. No vibrations, no noise.
The speed's going up 600, 700, 800. You feel overwhelmed. You just want to break into song.
But the Russians were still behind American technology in the race for the next generation of modern jet fighters. In the spring of 1949, a U.S. Air Force F-86 Sabre jet had flown supersonic for the first time.
The F-86, frankly, stood out in this field because of its graceful beauty and the fact that it was an airplane now with a jet engine, which we thought would be very simple, like turning a valve on to go and turning it off when you want to stop. It wasn't quite that simple, but nevertheless, it was a fantastic advancement in aeroscience.
Within a year of these outstanding developments, the American F-86 pilots would be locked in bitter combat with Russian MiG-15s over the skies of Asia. For the pilots of both countries, flying in the jet age would require new skills. Russian test pilots were worried about the tendency of the MiG to go into uncontrollable spins. One of its test pilots was killed after putting the MiG into a spin.
I have tested 22 types of planes for spinning characteristics. A spin has always been a difficult element of flying. In all planes, there were incidents when a pilot could not get out of a spin. When you are spinning, you have to switch off all your normal reflexes.
Spinning out of control is every pilot's nightmare. To survive in the jet age, the MiG pilots needed to keep a cool head and handle the aircraft with great sensitivity.
You have to overcome your instinctive responses. This is what made the MiG so different from all previous planes.
On May Day 1950, the MiG-15 flew past an unsuspecting audience in Moscow's Red Square in full view of Western diplomats. The intelligence failure of the Western observers to recognize Stalin's new powerful weapon in the skies above would have disastrous consequences. MiGs were already in the throes of full-scale production. Only a month later, the Soviet-supported North Korean People's Army launched a massive invasion of South Korea.
Stalin thought that the communists could invade South Korea without generating any military response from the West. Yes, there'd be the usual diplomatic protests, but it wouldn't go any further than that. In fact, he'd misjudged the situation badly. President Truman responded quickly. The United Nations agreed to send troops. And within 4 months, the invading North Koreans had been rolled right the way back.
Now, American B-29 bombers roamed across North Korea's skies with no resistance, and fighter bombers continuously attacked troop movements at will. By November 1950, UN forces had advanced right across North Korea and were approaching the Chinese border along the Yalu River. Mao Zedong, the Chinese communist leader, needed a cause to unite his young nation. The American advance to China's border provided the perfect opportunity. On Thanksgiving Day 1950, advanced units of the UN force in North Korea paused along the Yalu River, the border with China. On the following day, tens of thousands of soldiers of the Chinese People's Army stormed out of the mountains and attacked the UN forces. As the bitter winter weather closed in, UN troops were forced into a humiliating retreat. Stalin knew he had to support his communist ally, but only under total secrecy. In December 1950, Soviet MiGs were deployed in China to be flown secretly by disguised and highly experienced Russian pilots.
Сохранялась тайна нашей отправки на Дальний Восток. Сняли нас все знаки.
Our departure to China was to remain a secret, so all our insignia had to be removed. We looked as though we had been demobilized. On arrival, we were all given Chinese uniforms, but most officers did not like it. So as soon as they got their pay, the officers changed into civilian clothes and wore those instead.
Мы, когда прибыли в район боевых действий на аэродром
When we arrived at the area of military action at Antung Airfield, it was the time when the Americans had superiority of the air. But as our squadrons appeared there, we took the air supremacy away from them by attacking their piston fighter planes and bombers.
поршневыми самолетами и бомбардировщиками.
The sudden appearance of this new Soviet jet fighter would throw the West into a state of shock. The stage was now set, for the first jet versus jet encounters in fighter combat and a new chapter in the history of air war.
You're watching Heavy Metal here on the History Channel.
Mail call's coming, but tell us where.
The History Channel will see you there.
Mail Call, tonight at 8 on the History Channel.
You're watching Heavy Metal here on the History Channel.
December 1950, Soviet-built MiG-15s fly into action for the very first time.
The MiG-15 had an enormous impact when it appeared in the skies above Korea. First, it was a psychological blow to the Americans, who were shocked, frankly, at being technically outclassed by this new war machine. And secondly, it had a very severe physical impact. It was a cut above the propeller-driven aircraft which the Americans were using at the time, and it shot down an awful lot of fighters, and particularly bombers.
The Russian fighters operated secretly from safe bases around Antung, north of the Yalu River in China. The area between the Yalu River on the Chinese border and central North Korea became known as MiG Alley. Western aircraft entered at their peril. In addition to supplying the Chinese with MiGs, the Russians were also secretly training Chinese and North Korean pilots.
I was one of the 80 chosen to go to the Manchuria and trained first by the North Koreans to fly the propeller planes. After that, we turned over to the Soviet Air Force to learn to fly the jet planes. All we learned was just takeoff and landing. That's about it. And then they told us that we are now ready for the solo in the MiG-15. So everybody had some problems because of the tremendous thrust and also high altitude capabilities.
Если взять корейцев, с феодального века в реактивный.
The Koreans, they had to leap from the feudal age into the jet age. Can you imagine what a gap?
Ничего не видели, ничего не знали. И их сразу в реактивные.
They didn't know anything, and they were put into these jet planes. This wasn't easy to do.
Очень много словесно приходилось.
There was a lot of talking and persuading, and we had to convince them of how things had to be done.
Убеждать, что нужно так делать, так и так. Целый день понадобилось только узнать, как кого зовут, записать.
I needed a whole day to get to know their names and to get to know them. I didn't speak any Chinese, and those I had to teach didn't know any Russian. The pilots taught them to fly, and we taught them how to service and maintain the plane.
But the MiG's brief air supremacy was about to be challenged. Within weeks, a squadron of the new American F-86 Sabres was rushed from the United States to take the MiGs head-on.
You were afraid of them a little bit. And of course, with our F-86s, we knew it was a fine airplane, and we knew it had all kinds of combat capability, but until you actually engaged the enemy aircraft and actually found out you against the other fella how it performed, then it didn't give you a lot of confidence.
When the MiGs first engaged in head-to-head combat against the Sabres, they finally met their match. A new era in aerial combat was about to begin, the jet versus jet dogfight.
We were patrolling on this patrol line when we spotted these 4 airplanes coming toward us at a very impressive high rate of speed. My first impression then of the MiG was that I was up against something that was really a dynamo. So I started maneuvering into position to keep hitting him to see if I couldn't get the airplane to blow. And I used almost my entire load of ammunition on him before he finally looked like he was out of control and went on into the ground.
The MiG pilots realized they no longer had supremacy of the skies. Early dogfights meant that new tactics had to be learned fast.
This aerial combat was basically chaotic both vertically and horizontally. But from the battle we learned we should never fight sabers horizontally.
The MiG had a better than a 2,500 foot per minute rate of climb advantage. Could turn tighter, could out-accelerate, could out-decelerate, and were roughly the same speed. We talk about the 86 being faster and the MiG being faster. It depends on what altitude you're at. Now, we're not talking about a large or an excessive difference. We're talking maybe 3, 4, 5 miles an hour.
The Sabre was a good plane, but its engine seemed to be weaker because my MiG could climb up and escape from him, but he could not escape from me. I would always catch up with him. Our MiG was very well armed, much better than the Sabre. We had 3 machine guns, and the caliber of the guns was such that one hit could destroy a Sabre.
We just had 50 caliber. We could hit the MiG a number of times, and the MiG wouldn't necessarily go down. But if the MiG hit an F-86 a few times with those cannons, the F-86 was not going to make it home.
Мы дрались с ними, так честно говоря, в спортивном азарте.
We fought against them like sportsmen. Whoever handled their plane best won. If you are weak, bad luck.
Когда вот он на какое-то мгновение, может, в воздушном бою и там, который...
You look for a moment of hesitation. In an air battle, which lasts for, say, 20 minutes, you may only get 2 or 3 seconds. And once you notice him hesitating, that's when you press the trigger and hit the target.
The main role of the MiG-15 was to intercept American bombers raiding North Korea with their Sabre escorts. The principal MiG tactic was to take advantage of its superior altitude and lie in wait at heights up to 50,000 feet and then ambush the American air armadas below.
If possible, go up to 50,000 feet. 50,000 feet, then American plane wouldn't come up there. You go up to 50,000 feet and look down at the American plane, go down and shoot.
In October 1951, Lev Ivanov led a Soviet MiG attack on 48 B-29 bombers.
Шли они без прикрытия со стороны моря и шли градусов под...
They came flying in from the sea without cover at an angle of 30 degrees towards the bridge, which was the best approach to bomb it.
Пришли с опозданием прикрытия.
The Sabres came in to protect the bombers, but they were 4 minutes late, so naturally we took advantage of that.
Воспользовались, конечно. Как только увидел.
As soon as I saw a Sabre, I got onto its tail, aimed, fired, and that was that.
So many bombers were lost that this day became known as Black Tuesday. The MiGs had outmaneuvered, outflown, and outgunned their opponents. With precious few Sabres available to stand up to the MiGs, it looked as though the challenge of the Sabre was overrated. But for the Russians, the price of keeping their activities secret would play a major role in the battle for the skies over Korea. The Russian MiGs that roamed the skies above Korea had astonished the West. Now, total victory for either side looked unlikely. The Korean War would be a limited war, for the West to contain communism, and for the communists to avoid the humiliation of defeat. The Soviet MiG-15s enjoyed many advantages. They were flown out of bases across the border in China, which were out of bounds to the American air crews. So after combat in MiG Alley, the MiGs had a safe haven to return to. Although the MiGs were flying in Chinese colors, it was an open secret that many of the pilots were actually highly experienced Russian aces from World War II. But Russian pilots were walking a deadly fine line. Neither side could admit that US and Soviet jet pilots were facing each other in open combat for fear of escalating the conflict into a nuclear war.
The Russians, the Soviets were very hesitant for obvious reasons to say they were flying the MiG-15 aircraft. And so they simply never claimed or admitted that they were flying the airplanes, but we knew. I mean, we could listen to the broadcasts of fighter controllers and the fighter pilots, and it was clearly Russians flying the airplanes.
Вести переговоры на китайском языке в воздушном бою. Это не прижилось.
We were told to only communicate in Chinese during a combat. But it didn't work because we always broke into Russian. And sometimes we even broke the bounds of decent language. And we would swear at each other in the air.
The Soviet pilots experienced other frustrations as well. They were not allowed to fly over enemy territory in case they were shot down and a Russian pilot was captured and paraded before the world. Nor could they fly over the sea for fear of being shot down and both aircraft and pilot being captured.
Ну, лично сам я и летчикам своим внушал.
I decided that I must not be taken prisoner, and that I would rather crash the plane and kill myself. I would not become a prisoner of war.
Застрелишься там или еще что-нибудь, но в плен, чтоб не попасть.
Поэтому не рекомендовалось вылетать за линию фронта.
One pilot who had to be ejected crossed the front line by mistake. He was encircled by enemy troops. So rather than being taken prisoner and being tortured and humiliated, he took his own life by shooting himself. I think I would have acted in the same way.
Полка, летчик в воздушном бою.
The war for supremacy in the air began to produce aces on both sides. Colonel Yevgeny Pepelayev had the highest number of kills per mission, shooting down an enemy aircraft once every 5 missions.
Из 20 сбитых самолетов
out of 20 planes, I shot down 16 Sabres, 2 F-94s, 1 F-98, and 1 F-84. To shoot down an enemy plane, we tried to approach him from behind and as close as we could to his tail. The closer you are, the more likely the hit.
I had the gun sight almost on him, but it wasn't there, and I didn't fire. You don't shoot until the picture's right. He did not get away. I knocked his engine out. He was almost being consumed by engine fire.
During these dramatic dogfights in the air, MiG pilots discovered the remarkable abilities of their aircraft to take enormous punishment.
I was flying towards the ground, following my leader, as it was my responsibility to guard his tail. The American plane was waiting there for me to come out of the dive. It was then that he shot me.
И тут он меня подстрелит. Во время пикирования я вижу, что надо...
Then during the dive, I realized I must save myself, so I made a decision to eject. I moved my hand to the ejection handle and thought I'd pressed it, because in that moment I felt such G-force, such an enormous amount, I felt my bones were cracking. Then everything went dark and I fainted.
Я почувствовал, что у меня кости все затрещали. Потемнело в глазах. Я потерял сознание. Когда я пришел в себя, я глаза открыл.
When I came to, I opened my eyes and saw I was still in the plane. This came as a shock. If I had ejected myself, why was I still inside the plane? I grabbed the stick to gain control, and at that moment I heard a horrendous mechanical screeching. My brain was in overdrive. What shall I do next?
As all the hydraulic systems had been blown apart, Bondarenko did not know whether his landing gear was operational.
Я думаю, буду садиться грубо.
I thought that I'd have to do a belly landing with just the left wheel out. And as I approached the ground, I hit it with the wheel. And luckily for me, then the whole undercarriage came down.
Эти обе стойки стали. Я был счастлив.
I was so happy that this plane had saved my life. It's not just words, it's true. It used all its remaining strength to return me home and land.
Прилетел и сел. Я подошел.
I came up to the plane and I kissed it on the nose, and I thought how wonderful we have such miraculous technology.
Какое счастье, что такая у нас чудесная техника.
The MiG-15 had earned its affectionate nickname, Samolyat Soldat, the soldier aircraft. By spring 1953, the Korean Air War was at a stalemate. The U.S. military, keen to capture the Russian technology, offered a huge reward and political asylum to any pilot that delivered a MiG to South Korea. No one had yet responded. But a daring escape attempt by a lone pilot would provide a last-minute twist to a war that seemed to have no end.
You're watching Heavy Metal here on the History Channel. Tonight on the History Channel.
I am talking landmines, specifically Claymore. Mine is actually named after a military sword called the Claymore. Now that's my kind of upper body workout.
Mail Call, tonight at 8 on the History Channel.
Everybody stand back!
By 1953, both sides recognized that the Korean War was unwinnable. After 2 years of negotiations, in July, a truce was finally signed at Panmunjom. But the Korean Peninsula would remain a divided armed camp.
The fighting in Korea came to an end in July 1953, but of course the Cold War still went on. And during it, both sides were trying to get hold of one another's secrets, particularly in terms of military technology. The Americans were especially anxious to get their hands on a MiG-15.
The military made an offer of $100,000, equivalent to several $1 million today, and political asylum for the first pilot who would defect and deliver a MiG intact. A 21-year-old North Korean pilot, Lieutenant No Kun-sok, an ardent anti-communist, was already planning one of the most spectacular escapes from the communist bloc.
So my aim was that how to defect successfully and land on American air base so that I can ask for political asylum. So on September 21st, Sunday morning, even before the breakfast, I got in the plane and took off to north. And then the plane went to north and I came down south and toward the Pyongyang, toward the east. And that's where I finally made the defect. It was not easy. In fact, that defection was harder than equivalent to, say, 50 combat mission.
Now, south of the demilitarized zone, he flashed into UN territory. Just 4 tense minutes after crossing the border, he spotted the U.S. Kimpo Air Base and decided to risk a landing.
Radar people missed me, and also anti-aircraft gunners I was afraid of, they missed me.
He decided to land when, to his amazement, he saw a Sabre coming straight towards him at the opposite end of the runway.
Well, he hadn't seen me, so we landed together, both ends. Then we passed in the runway, and of course I knew he was there. He was coming down, but he hadn't seen me until we passed. Then after passed, of course he was frightened. That at the end of the runway, he stopped the engine and he jumped out. And he was wondering what kind of nuts landed from the wrong side.
Commanders at the base panicked, thinking the war had started again, and scrambled every plane they had. Lieutenant No Kum Sok did not know of the reward. He just wanted to fly to freedom. The surrendered MiG-15 was taken to Okinawa, where it was dismantled and rigorously examined. It was later airlifted to the United States and underwent further exhaustive flight testing. The plane was pushed to its limits by America's top test pilots, Tom Collins and the world-renowned Chuck Yeager.
I told Chuck Yeager that don't deliberately go into spinning stall, because this plane is very quirky. Sometimes you get out, sometimes you cannot come out. If you cannot come out, you have to bail out and you lose the plane. So he didn't put the plane to deliberate stall. Americans wondered well, the MiG-15 could be a supersonic. Then Chuck Yeager has proved that it's not a supersonic, because he actually went up to 50,000 feet. He dived down, straight down, and he almost lost his life because he was totally out of control, and the control system didn't respond until he got down as low as near 3,000 feet. And the chaser plane flown by Tom Collins hand gestured him to bail out. But he didn't bail out, and somehow he pulled out at 3,000 feet above the water.
The test flights proved that indeed the MiG was an exceptional plane, but revealed no new supersonic technology. The defector, Lieutenant No Kum Sok, went to work for the U.S. government and became an American citizen. With the Korean truce signed, the Soviet MiG pilots returned home, but the MiG-15 had already earned its place in history. Eventually, the Russians claimed the MiG combat record gave them a 4-to-1 advantage. The U.S. claimed a 10-to-1 ratio in favor of the F-86 Sabre against the MiG-15. But whatever the final score, the MiG-15 was an extraordinary aeronautical achievement and way ahead of its time.
I think in terms of the challenges that the Soviet design bureaus confronted in putting together the MiG-15, given the limitations of technology that they confronted in industrial production, that they did an incredible job in putting together an aircraft that could really challenge the F-86.
The plane was very easy to handle and very reliable. At high altitude, it was superior to the Sabre because of its ability to operate at a much higher ceiling. The MiG was way ahead of its time, and all other planes in the world, apart from the Sabre, of course.
You could perform all kinds of high-speed maneuvers. It was a great fighter. I liked it and was very impressed by it.
Back in the Soviet Union, it would be 40 years before the Russian pilots could admit to having fought in the Korean War. Eventually, over 13,000 MiGs would be produced and flown by most of the communist bloc nations. Fortunately for the West, no other MiG fighter would ever cause such a surprise as had the MiG-15 in the secret air wars over Korea. Yet for its pilots, the MiG remains the supreme jet fighter.
The MiG-15 was the best plane in the world, the best fighter in the world. I am convinced of that because it saved my life. It was very tough and could take a lot of punishment. It was a lovely plane, and I can bow to it with gratitude.